Yeah, some of you have been on calls with Lacy before. We did a Zoom call with her a few months back, and that was a lot of fun. And so it was. We were thinking that we wanted to continue with her. And tonight, the specific topic is conversations with children, and Lacy's book that came out last year. And Lacy, you just got some award for this book. I just saw Sharon had posted something.
I did. Yes.
Yeah, what exactly was that?
Oh, the IVP Reader's Choice Award. So InterVarsity Press Reader's Choice.
Excellent. Well, that's cool. Well, I'm glad to hear that. And I went through this book earlier when you sent it to me last fall, and then again, just kind of went through it again, looking at some of the stuff that was in there, stuff that I had highlighted, and just the really interesting stuff. So for those of you who don't know Lacy and I became friends through the Renovare Institute, where Lacy was a spiritual director and I was a student, and we had a fun time getting to know each other, and have stayed friends for since that time. So Lacy, I really appreciate your work and your heart, and always love conversations. And I feel like I've learned a lot about listening from you, mostly because whenever we Zoom or talk, I talk a lot and you listen. And I always think I should talk less, but it's not really in the cards for me. So anyway, welcome, Lacy. And yeah, I don't know if you want to say a few things, and then I'll maybe launch us forward with just an initial question that's been kind of on my mind a little bit.
Well, maybe I can just share for those of you who may not have been on the call before, sort of what do I do besides shovel snow here in Western Colorado and try to stay centered with my 16-year-old who was lamenting the fact that she's an extrovert born to two introverted parents at this stage in COVID. I'm a spiritual director. So I sit one-on-one with adults, and I also sit one-on-one with children, and listen to what is happening in their life with God. And I sit with children at a facility for families without homes. And during the time of COVID, you can imagine, it's a little bit dicey. So I meet with them over Zoom. So I'm meeting with children, listening to what's stirring in them with their life with God over Zoom, children who are in a homeless facility. And so that's where this book comes from, my experience of that. And I often say I'm not a children's pastor. I was an educator early on in my life, but I've never been a children's pastor. But I do sit with children in spiritual direction. So like the particulars of being a children's pastor, I don't know about, but the spiritual lives of children, I have been involved in for going on 8 years now.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. Your work at Haven House, right? It's called Interests Me. I was reading a little bit again about that, but yeah, just the work there is. Another part that was interesting to me was just what you wrote in your book about grandparenting, and that's been a new journey for us. So it's just there's so much there to talk about. I guess what I would love to hear first of all, and then I think you're going to share some things specifically, but I have been really interested over the past couple of years, and specifically just in terms of listening generally, and maybe difficult conversations, with just the idea of curiosity. And you bring that up early in the book, just that sense of being curious with people. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about just how curiosity, really fuels just the listening conversations. I think in general, right? But also with children. And so just curious about that.
I think you used a wonderful word when you started talking, which is the word wonder. And keeping alive this wonder in conversations with adults and with children is what helps conversation to be rich. anytime that we make assumptions about the person in front of us, it cuts off the conversation. We make an assumption, and so the conversation comes to an end. And if we start to understand that children have a deep, incredible life with God, and that we actually get a tiny, tiny glimpse of it, of what is really happening with them, that can stir our wonderings about what is this like for you? How do you experience this? And that can help the conversation to open up. Keeping that curiosity hot happens when we suspend our assumptions about knowing. We assume because we experience this way, children experience it this way, but that's just simply not the case. So I love this idea of curiosity means keeping wondering hot. And it's noticing when we get, and the great Quaker Douglas Steere says, once we move into assumptions, we have hardening of the categories. This sense that our knowledge becomes hardened, and that doesn't keep the curiosity fluid with us. And we make these assumptions all the time, constant assumptions about what the other person, like right now, John has just put his hand up to his face and rubbed his finger. So I might have the assumption that he's bored, or that or that he's wondering, tacos for dinner, was that really a good? So that can be sort of an assumption that I bring to this conversation. Whereas I could say, John, I saw you rub your finger across the top of your lip. Is that a thoughtful posture for you? What was going through your mind? Mm-hmm. And do you see how the conversation and curiosity opens up from there, rather than me thinking, really tacos for dinner?
Yeah, that's good. It was a steak, and I was putting my hand over my mouth to say to Charlene, "Can you keep the dog from barking?" The professor's in the background, and I can't. He's like, "Yeah, that's great." Yeah, there's so much I want to say about that, but we're here to listen to you. So that's really. I just love that idea. We were having a conversation this weekend with some friends, and I said, I love it when my stereotypes are blown out of the water.
Oh, isn't it wonderful?
It really, truly is, if you can handle it, if you can handle that. So that's great. Well, Lacy, I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of take some time now. And then let me just say to the rest of you, I have the chat bar open. So if you chat a question in there, write a question in there, I will try to be attentive to that and pose that question or comment to Lacy, and we'll go that way. And you're welcome to do that as she's going forward. So
the reason that I created a PowerPoint for you is so that you can you have something tangible. I mean, I know you could print it out and then it's really tangible, but something that you can take with you and re-look at. So I'm going to go through just kind of a short teaching on some key points, and then you have that. But as you are kind of listening, I'd like to invite you to wonder. So even as John and I were talking about wonder, that you notice your own assumptions, and that some of the things that I offer or say may prick some wondering in you. And I just invite you to notice that and make some questions. They don't have to be totally, we're not talking a capital and a question mark at the end. If you just have some wonderings, go ahead and offer them. And we're going to make time at the end to really meet you where you are and talk about some of the things that are stirring. So I'm going to employ the great miracle of screen sharing, and hopefully that will work out. All right, can everyone see the screen? Yes?
Yes.
Thumbs up, good. Well, it's a miracle. So I want to begin. John, you talked about in the very first part of the book that I give this story about Christopher. And my first experience with understanding that children have such a depth of spiritual and inner life happening within them was I was a public school teacher in inner city Rochester, New York. And I had a student who was kicked out of the lunchroom. He wasn't allowed to eat lunch in the lunchroom anymore. I was a brand new teacher, just had finished my master's degree, and I thought I was smarter than I was. If you are in your early 20s, you may remember that sometimes when we're in that age, we think that we are smarter than we actually are. And I was in over my head. So I had exhausted all options for this little friend, and he had to eat lunch with me every day. And I had no energy to offer him anything. So we just sat in silence, and sometimes I asked him a few questions. And those wondering kinds of questions opened up an incredible wealth of a world in this young man. Incredible. He talked about goodness. He talked about beauty. He talked about the ebb and flow of his life. And I was, again, it wasn't that I had any wisdom. It's that I was just too tired. And then miraculously, the Spirit met us both in that place, because what he really needed was a listening ear. And I needed to learn from him and his experiences. So it was after that, during my doctoral work, that I started thinking about Jesus's invitation in Mark chapter 10. And I wonder if I can read that to you for just a second, because we want to ground, I think, our thinking about children and children's spirituality in Jesus. People were bringing little children to him in order that he might touch them. And the disciples spoke sternly to them. So can you see the scene in your mind's eye? People were bringing little children to Jesus in order that he might touch them. And the disciples spoke sternly to them. But when Jesus saw this, he was indignant, and he said to them, "Let the little children come to me, and do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs. Truly I tell you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it." Can you imagine how that must have really flipped their lid? In that time, children were, the younger the child, the less human they were thought to have been, because humanity was believed to be governed by your ability to reason. And as there was just such high infant mortality, it was very difficult for adults to attach to children. So you hear what Jesus is saying? He is elevating the child in such a way that culturally was not understood. And then he took them up in his arms, laid his hands on them, and blessed them. It was a radical thing that Jesus did. Notice Jesus's first words in the passage, let. Let implies an already forward-moving progression. The children are already coming. It is their natural inclination to seek connection with other people and with God. It is their natural inclination. God has been longing for, is longing now, and will continue to long for children. And further, the children are wired to long back for God. The movement is already at hand. I think what I learned from Jesus in this passage personally, as a parent, so I'm going to situate it in my most tender place as a parent, is that it is the most challenging thing to trust my children into God's care. That I don't have to, I need to show up and be faithful, but I don't have to pressure, manipulate, or control. That God has longed them into existence, and their natural inclination is to long back. The last time we were together, I think we did talk about these 4 elements for Christian spiritual formation. And that's what we're talking about, Christian spiritual formation. And the place that listening with children sort of situates itself is around this first element, God's self. That God gives God's self to every human being. And so when we listen to children, we help them to hear and see and experience where God is already longing for them. So that kind of gives us a place to situate our listening. In the other elements, like in life, one of the ways that listening serves life is that we can help children, when we listen to them, to hear themselves. When we think about all the voices that are speaking into a child's life, it's not just our voice, right? It's also the church's voice. It's also the voice of what they see on TV. It's also their friend's voice. So they have lots and lots and lots of voices speaking to them. But when do we ever help them to hear themselves? One of the great gifts that parents and grandparents and aunties and uncles and pastors and all kinds of adults can give to children is to help them to hear themselves. You know, their vocational calling will come from deep within them, the place where their own deep longing meets God's invitation to them. So how do we help them to hear their own wants? The incarnational life of Jesus, and we've talked about this before, the one spiritual practice that I always say, do 2 spiritual practices if you have to do any. One is really help your children to know the Gospels backwards and forwards, so that they know the stories of Jesus, and that the life of Jesus is the lens through which their whole imagination is shaped for seeing the rest of the world. So that even in your conversations, just regular conversations, questions like, does this remind you of anything from the life of Jesus? And so that our children know those stories enough that they become part of the everyday fabric of their lives. And then the other spiritual practice was the examine, which we'll talk about a little later. So there are 2 movements in listening with children. And that means whether we're having casual conversation over dinner, these conversations can happen. I mean, a great place to have them is in the car. We have some of the best conversations. That's one of the things actually that we are missing in our home, because we don't go anywhere. And we just recently went to visit our college daughter, and I noticed that my 16-year-old chattered the whole time. Friends, it's a 6-hour drive. And she talked for nonstop for 6 hours. But what had happened is our normal time of talking in the car, and what makes it just such a sacred space is that we're both focused not on each other. So there's a lessening of pressure because we're not staring at one another. We're looking somewhere else. And I am thinking about driving, and she drives too. And then I'm thinking about how to put on the brake, but that's a whole other story. Our primary focus is elsewhere. So it takes the pressure and gives us some freedom in conversation. So wherever you are having these conversations, whether they are intentional, you're setting down to have them, or they're as everyone's washing the dinner dishes, think about having 2 movements in that conversation. One is to recognize. Asking questions around, and remember we had talked about early on about wonder, wondering where God is at work in the child's life. And we can ask simple questions around, what are some good things that you have experienced today? What's something good? Because goodness, beauty, truth, wonder, awe, all of those things are God's fingerprints in the world. They are how God reveals God's self. And so we can ask children to help to our questions around recognizing. And then the second movement is respond. How would you like to respond to what you recognized? How would you like to respond to the goodness that you saw? So today in the church year, it's Shrove Tuesday. And generally, you eat a lot of pancakes. And today, my spouse made waffles and bacon. And can I get a witness? It was just so very wonderful. And so we were having this meal together as a family at the table. And I said, oh, what is something good? I wonder if we can all share something good that has happened today. And my daughter held up this strip of bacon and she was like, this is good today. And there's something a little bit, about Jesus, who is Jewish, and we are enjoying the bacon, but let's just all take a deep breath around that. And so I said, oh yeah, I'm totally with you on that. And how would you like to respond to that goodness? And she just flipped her head back and she said, thank you, God, for bacon and for waffles and for my family here at the table on Shrove Tuesday. It happened in 30 seconds. That's a spiritual conversation. And what it does is it lays down a neurological footprint in the brain that literally transforms our minds. So in that recognize and respond, neurons that fire together, wire together, and literally she will be looking for those good things in other parts of her day and her life. This is, and you all, I think, got to spend some time with Trevor, this is a quote of Trevor's, we often ask for the gift of tongues when it might be more helpful to ask for the gift of ears. And I have a 19-year-old and a 16-year-old. And more often than I'd like to admit, I work very hard to shape and form them with the gift of tongues rather than the gift of ears. And it's not that we don't speak when we are parents. It's that when speaking follows a deep listening, the speaking has more weight. It just does. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. So you may be wondering, okay, that's wonderful, Lacy. How do I have the gift of ears here? Well, these are simple active listening, simple ways to do active listening. So when a child, you've asked the question, you've said, what is something good that has happened to you today? What is something beautiful that you saw or encountered today? Or did you hear God speak to you today? When did you know that God was near to you? So any of those kind of open-ended, wondering questions. Well, first, try mirroring so that you can help them to open their experience up. These are all ways to wonder. Notice the words or pictures so you'll have to listen, really listen to them. Notice what has some weight to it, what feels important, and then offer them back to them. So my daughter says the thing about the bacon, and I say, wow, bacon is what you're really focusing on today. See, I've just mirrored the word back to her. And she says, yeah, bacon. And we go from there. So that mirroring is just to offer them back a words or the picture that they share so that they can hear themselves. I remember when my oldest daughter, she's studying environmental engineering right now, when she was discerning what was the way forward. And she has such a heart for the environment. And I remember one time she was talking about it and she was helping our neighbor with her irrigation. So we live rurally and we have to move irrigation pipe and all kinds of things. And she said, Mom, there's just got to be a better way to use water. And I said, Aiden, tell me some more about that better way to use water. See, I took the most important parts, and it's really very, very simple. It's just the weighty words that are heavy, and we give them a chance to hear themselves. And when she heard that, yeah, that I just think there's a better way, and that gave her energy, and she could start to hear her own deep longings and vocational invitation to herself. Another thing is we notice similarities. You know, when our children tell us things, they tell us lots of stories, especially if you have a verbal processing extrovert in your home. You'll get a lot of words. And notice those similarities in their stories and offer them back to them. What a gift that would be to have someone listen to all your stories and notice how they come together. Another way to have the gift of ears is to use light paraphrasing to say, are you saying to me that bacon is where you are meeting God today on Shrove Tuesday? And sometimes they'll push back and say, no, actually, it's not the bacon. It's the maple syrup, really, where it is. So just, and letting ourselves be corrected in our understanding. And then a brief summary, which is what we offer kids again to help them hear themselves. So you met God in us coming together and enjoying a meal. Yeah, that's exactly where I met God. So just those 4 simple ways to listen. There's a wonderful research around how children perceive love. And we think if we say it, and sometimes we think if we buy them things, that we communicate love to them. But that's actually not true. These 3 particular were across the board, generally present in children's descriptions of feeling loved. They were heard, they were acknowledged, and they were encouraged. So when a child was speaking, the adult let them speak all the words that they had. And granted, can I just also take us parents off the hook and say there are times when we have to say, can I listen to you a little bit later? You know, right now I'm in the middle of a call, or right now I've got some work to do, or the kitchen's on fire. Can you just hang on for just a second? So there are these 3 ways that help that children perceive love. The first is to hear. The second is to acknowledge. So really embracing our role as a witness to their life. We get to witness their life with God. So, and that means in the repeating back of what they've heard. And the third is to encourage and offering a word of encouragement, a word of hope. That's how children perceive love. And so that brings us to some practical ways of engagement with children. I think this acronym is so very helpful. To remember that every moment is pregnant with possibility, and the acronym BOW. So when we are listening to children, we want to have our bodies towards them. That is just a simple way to say, I am listening. So my 16-year-old reminds me that this in front of me does not mean that I am listening. This is my phone. And that's a good thing for me to remember. I just read an article in the New York Times that said the number one complaint of teenagers, tweens and teenagers about their parents is them looking at screens when the children are trying to talk to the parents. Which is interesting because I, as a parent, I feel like I'm fussing at my kids all the time to get off the phone, to get off their devices. And yet that's their chief complaint as well. So I wonder if there's some reciprocal attention that we need to give. So the first is body. Body, if we have our arms crossed, we're saying, I'm sort of closed off to what you have to share. You know, if my daughter is, if we're having a bit of vigorous fellowship and she's making her case about something, I often find that I will cross my legs or cross my arms. And you can guarantee that she's going to push even harder because my body is saying, I'm not open to what you have to say. She often reminds me as well that when my hands are on my hips, I'm in an aggressive position and she doesn't feel I'm really listening well to her. So just noticing that your body is facing and that you kind of have an open posture. And what that does is that just communicates to the child, I'm listening, I'm here, I'm with you. The O is openness. So internally, are you open to whatever they may have to say? And that can be so hard because the things that they may share with us may be things that we don't want to hear. And it may challenge our trust in God. It may challenge what we think of our own parenting. But do we have that internal openness that says, you can bring anything to me? And only we can notice that. And the W is wonder. So as John brought up in the beginning, that wonderful, pervasive sense of curiosity. Like, I wonder what God is up to in your life. So that's the first thing, just to keep that BOW in mind when we're listening to our children. And I think, are you on mute, John?
Yeah, Lacy, can I just ask I
Yes.
just make a exclamation point on what you just said, that idea of, do we have an open posture to genuinely hear? You are asking us that question. I feel like I just want to put a punctuation there in a way as say, that's a serious question you're asking.
Yeah.
Are we actually open, right? Because I think it could be that we would say, well, I'm here, of course I'm open, but I think it's really helpful, particularly as you're maybe parenting, but in other ways too, to really seriously ask ourselves that question: am I genuinely in a place where I can genuinely listen to whatever's going to come up here, and I'm ready to listen. I really genuinely want to listen. It just seems like that's a serious question that we sometimes assume, yeah, I am interested, but we kind of need to work and maybe sit with that a little bit for ourselves.
Yeah, I think that I think we do. I also think that we don't know we're not open until our child shares something we didn't really want to hear.
Yeah.
And so we have to notice in ourselves that we have extended the invitation. Our child has brought whatever they have brought. We have to notice our own strong emotions. And when those get stirred, our job is to hold, this is a good Quaker phrase, but to hold center until we can deal with our strong emotions and then circle back around. And that's a skill. Nobody wakes up with it.
Yep. Yep. Thank you.
I'm so glad you stopped. Good question. And it becomes more and more critical as they age. Can we say that? It becomes more and more critical as they age.
Yeah.
And we lay those foundations of BOW when they're young so that we can build on them when they're old. And at the same time, it's never too late. It is never too late to be fully present, body, openness, and wonder. There's a video that I made on the Examine through Renovari, and I'm glad to share it, John, if you'd like to put it up somewhere rather than taking a few minutes to talk about it, because I do want to get to grief.
Yeah. Send that to me, Lacy. I'll make sure everyone gets it.
Okay. In I have a devotional, Good Dirt, Lent, Holy Week, and Eastertide, and I think John, y'all have a few at the church. I talk about having a prayer box, so a little 3x5 index card, 3x5 index card box, just in the middle of the table. And on it, you can have prayers or poems or interesting questions. And then when you sit down to a meal, pop them open. Ask a question. What's a good question? And then just kind of go through them. Maybe they're just an interesting short poem or an interesting prayer, and give everyone the opportunity to share. And maybe you even teach your children about bow, body, openness, wonder. Can they be that way with their siblings? Can they be that way with you? And giving yourself the opportunity to model it. Just that, keeping that listening conversation flowing in your family, having just that little box on the table that you can pop open and practice is a great way to also notice those two movements, to recognize and respond. And these are some other ways that you can absolutely look at. Okay, I want to show you a couple things. One are these prayer beads. And in the book, Listening Conversations with Children, is that the name of it? Yeah, Spiritual Conversations with Children. It's pitiful, I just forgot the name. Anyway, I talk about how to make these beads, these prayer beads. And one of the things that we found very helpful that lots of parents do is just to create what we call the tent of meeting, just a place in the home where children could go and have these intentional time with God. And for adults, we called it their prayer corner or their prayer chair. Well, how about a tent of meeting for your children? For us, it was a SpongeBob SquarePants tent when the kids were little. It was small, it was blue, and it had SpongeBob on it. But inside of it, we had a little lantern, we had a children's Bible, we had a place where they could write their prayers. And it was just a tent of meeting, a place where they could go and engage with God. And I'll admit, I crawled in it a few times, just needing some quiet place. So you might think of how you might use it as well. But it's just a really beautiful spot. Using prayer beads are wonderful for helping children just engage in prayer. And how they work is, well, there's nothing special about them. So let me just first say that. These are wooden beads on a string with a plastic cross. But what it does is help that recognize and respond rhythm. So when a child wants to pick these up and pray, they can move the beads to one side and do the recognize. So as they move the beads, they maybe notice the places where God was with them throughout the day and they're talking to God about them. Maybe they're talking about the sadness or some difficulty that they were feeling in the day. Then when they get to the cross, they take 3 deep breaths. And those 3 deep breaths help to wake up the part of the brain that houses our experiences of God. So it's not just breathing although we do all need to breathe. But what happens is when we intentionally take those 3 deep breaths, that influx of oxygen to the brain wakes up the anterior cingulate. And we literally, it's the place where we have those experiences of God are stored, and it wakes up. And then we move the beads back and you invite them to listen to what God might be saying to them as you move them back. And this is something that I've had children carry a little set of beads in their backpack to school. We kept them on the coffee table in different places, and they could just pick them up and they talk with God going one way. They take 3 deep breaths and listen on the way out. And it works the same way in a finger labyrinth. So these are easy. Again, the patterns for all of these things are in the book, so you can use them. But as children are so very tactile, they use their bodies for everything. Their bodies are integrated into their spiritual life. So saying to them, stop a moment and pray, but keep your body still, is so counterintuitive to children because their bodies are part of who they are. And so they need things like finger labyrinths and prayer beads. And with the children at Haven House, we pray Psalm 23 with the body. And there's some instructions on how to do that in the back of the book in the appendix. But praying with their bodies is part of who they are. So let's talk just a minute about grief. So grief for children looks like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. You think about trying to hold a beach ball underwater. It will just hop up for them at any time. For children, grief doesn't only look like sadness, it also looks like anger. It can look like silence and pulling into themselves. Children grieve in windows of time. So they may grieve here and then it will go back under for a little while. It'll pop up here and then it'll go back for a little while. It's just like open windows. And the reason is because their capacity for grief is limited. So they'll feel it for a little bit and then they really have to table it. And without a safe place to process their grief, so we're talking about lots of children with lots of grief because of COVID. They have lost school, friendships, just their loved ones, events that they had hoped for. They feel left behind in school, many of them. So they almost, I think, nationwide, we are going to have a crisis of grief in our children. And they need a safe place to be able to express it. Grief doesn't look the same for any two people, and that's true for children. For some children, they will draw into themselves. For some children, they will act out. The feelings that are connected to grief are feelings of anxiety. Am I safe? So one of the things that this grief will unearth is this wonderment around, am I safe? And that leads to worry. Some children report in this time just almost micromanaging where their parents are and what their community is doing. And that comes from this anxiety of, am I safe? There are also, in some communities, and across our nation, we haven't had a unified response to COVID. And because of that, whatever the unity we thought it needed to be, whatever level, but because of that, they are feeling different than their peers. So because different families have responded to different ways, they haven't felt together, they felt torn apart. They also have feelings of guilt in grief. Oh, I should have done this if I had done this. And some of the children that I'm meeting with at Haven House are feeling like, oh, my grandmommy or my aunt got sick, and did I give it to them? And they may have not even come within 6 feet. They may have not even seen, because rationality is not play into the guilt that they feel. They cannot say, well, I have been home, I haven't seen anyone. No, if someone got sick, they will immediately blame themselves. So they need a lot of opportunity to say how they feel about COVID and about the impact on them. Children ages 3 to 5 carry grief in their bodies. And that means that they can regress to developmental stages that were before them. Their understanding of death is limited and their feeling vocabulary is limited. That's the struggle for young children in grief. So can I encourage you, if you are around children and you have children around you, keeping some blank paper and some kind of colors or markers, waterproof. I mean, washable. That's what I mean, washable. My hardwood floors will tell you that washable markers are the way to go. Just having them around so that they can express how they feel in color. They will be able to do that more than naming a word. All children need safe and appropriate ways of expressing their aggressive emotions. So again, grief for some children can look like anger and aggression, and teaching them ways of expressing their anger and their really strong feelings in safe ways. And one of the ways is to move bodies. I think one of the great things that we can do for our children right now is to, where we have access, is to get outside and move our big muscle groups. It helps to literally lower the anxiety in their body that they carry. And if you go walking with a child, again, it's that you're facing outward, you're not facing each other. You might notice some grief conversations opening up. So how can you help a child through grief? Listen. So begin by listening, that BOW. Second, for grief, is speak the truth. So if you have a child who is blaming themselves, you are going to need to tell them the truth. It is not your fault that Auntie died of COVID. It is not your fault. And you will need to say that after you have listened to them speak over and over and over again. And the third thing is to give them structure and stability, because that means safety. So whatever kind of structure you can offer them, say, and remind them, no, we are here, you are safe. These are the things that are still here. That is going, all of that will help them. And again, grief you don't just turn it on and turn it off. That will help them deal with their grief. I think we're almost at maybe 15 years ago. My children were with me as we accompanied my grandfather as he died of pancreatic cancer. And I was just shocked that they didn't cry. They didn't cry at his funeral. They didn't cry as we cared for him. But what was interesting is several weeks after that, we were at home, and we had a baby goat that died, and it was a rainy spring day, and my oldest daughter said, "I want to go and bury this goat." And she hadn't been there she was not really attached to it, but she wanted to do this. And she went out with a pickaxe and dug in the mud. She was covered in mud, and she put this little goat in a pillowcase and buried it. And I just caught a glimpse at her from a distance, and she was sobbing. And when she came back in the barn, she said, "I'm just so sad about Grandpa." Our griefs are connected. So she couldn't grieve for him at that time. It was later that her grief came through in this place. So don't be surprised if it doesn't pop up when you think it should. It will come up when it needs to. So maybe I can sort of stop right there and invite some questions or some comments.
Yeah, if you have a question, it would be great if you would want to type it to me in the chat. Natalie, you had a question about, we're all at different stages, but about younger children and listening.
Yeah, I'm just curious that what that you talk about the BOW, and what that balance looks like when my kids are all 4 and under. So I could spend my whole day like looking straight at them, investing in those conversations. And I'm just curious what that balance looks like of taking the time to stop and listen, but the reality of trying to get things done and move through the day. And
That's a wonderful question. And a lot of it will depend on your own discernment as a parent. So it might be that you notice that a particular child needs a level of listening in whatever season. One of the times that I think is just ripe for parent listening is when we put them to bed. And it's ripe for the child, but exhausting for us, can I just also admit? Because I'm just wanting to really get out of there. It's like, we've had 47 drinks of water. Please, can you go to sleep? You're 16 years old. But no. So it may be that you make sure that you have that you've slotted some listening time with each child once a week or once a day. So I also want to say that that a healthy, sane parent is one of the most wonderful gifts that we can give children. So please be gentle with yourself. You are a gift to your children in your sanity. But just even slotting some time. And you might notice that you have a particular kid who's got a particular thing in this season. And so you want to pay them a little more listening attention. How does that settle for you?
yeah, I mean, it definitely gives me something to think about. And yeah, thank you.
One of the questions that was in my mind a little bit, Lacy, was, as a parent, it's like what we're talking about. I understand, there's parenting and then there's listening. There are those times when, okay, what I need you to do, and maybe it's even more important when our kids are smaller, but there are times when it's like, I just need you to do this thing right now. I need you to put the toys away, or I need you to not hit your brother or whatever. But there's the parenting piece. And how do you kind of separate that parenting from this sense of direction and listening? And can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I think our parenting has to be infused with listening. And listening to our children doesn't mean that we suspend who we are and our job as parents. Our listening informs it. It helps us know how to speak. So bringing our authentic and vulnerable selves to a listening conversation is important. And that means saying, what you said or what you did is, maybe we name it, is disrespectful or even painful to me, and I'm going to boundary and not let you do that. That doesn't mean that we weren't listening. That means that we were boundaried. In fact, being boundaried helps children to have their own boundaries, and it helps them to know how to react with us, how to be in our presence. So it's not generous listening and being a good parent. Our listening infuses our parenting. Yeah. John, give me some conversation about this.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. I mean, it's helpful, I think, and again, our kids are a little bit older, but I think it's been interesting as they've gotten older to find that space where it's like, okay, my job in this moment is to listen and to help that conversation along, and not to be like, I really need you to toe the line on this thing, which sometimes we do need them to toe the line on things.
Yes.
Right? So I get that. And you talk about in the book, and I think this is really helpful as well, Lacy, the idea that God is pursuing our kids. I don't think I figured this out until lately. And I don't even know that figuring out means that I don't stress about it. But you know that moment where you realize that in these conversations, if you listen, you can go, okay, there, like God is moving my kid in a way that I was not prepared for. And it helps me not to panic, to realize that he loves them and is drawing them even more than I love them, which is hard, at least for me and probably for most parents, to imagine that God is actually more interested in their direction. So I just, that came out as I was looking back again through the book, just that idea that, and it's been an interesting challenge for me over the last few years, especially to say, God has deep, deep interest and love in my kids. And so how do I take a step back and just try to be a part of moving that conversation instead of, okay, here's what I need.
And yes, I think anytime I notice myself getting all controlly with my kids, even when they were young, I started to learn, and I started to learn later later than they wish I had, to ask the question, am I trusting you, God? Do I believe that you are actually for my children? And that is my own spiritual formation.
Yeah.
My own invitation for spiritual formation.
Yeah, I think that's one of those questions I want to like stop and say, that's a serious question. Like, do I really trust God with them? And that's a question we have to sort through.
And sometimes the answer is, right now, I don't.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Will you help me, Lord?
Yeah. Interesting book, Lacy. I'm sure I'm guessing you're familiar with Gary Thomas's work, but he has a book, Sacred Marriage and Sacred Parenting. And I love his approach because he's a spiritual formation guy. That's his thing. And so he talks a lot about how parenting is really, it's about God shaping us. He uses our kids to shape us. And some of these questions are really helpful for that. Hey, another question that was asked here is it possible to bow with two children together at once, or does it always need to be on an individual basis?
I think, well, that's a great question. Let me think about that. I think we can bow, and it depends on who the speaker is. So, I mean, if two children are there together, it's whoever is speaking is who we are bowing to. And it's reciprocal connecting conversations will have bow. I mean, you think about a really delicious conversation that you have had with an adult, those three elements will be there. They just will. And so it just makes sense that it will be there for children when we are being present to children.
Yeah.
One of the things that you were again talking about listening and how much listening time to give. It just sort of developed with my oldest daughter that she would just run and catapult herself onto our bed and say, this is the listening space. So anytime that I could hear her voice called to me, standing on our bed, laying on our bed, it was almost like this little island of listening. And she would just come, okay, I just need you to listen to me. And we'd go sit on the bed and listen to her for a little while. It was a grace during the teenage years.
Yeah, that's really good. So Katerina has a question. Hey, Kat, dive in.
There we go. Sorry, I was
There you go.
technologically challenged. I actually read your book last week, not knowing that this Zoom call was going to happen. And it was so great. I've got 5 little boys. And the one question that I kept thinking the whole time is I was like, I want to do this with my kids. And this kind of goes off Natalie's question. When you just have a lot of young children, I've just been wrestling with like logistically how, like I can't, and I don't expect you to necessarily answer this question. I'm just curious, like, when your kids were young, would you set aside one-on-one time with them to intentionally, I feel like I would have to have like a date with a kid to do listening prayer together. Is that what you would recommend? Or do you have any thoughts or advice for parents who want to start this with kids, but have so many freaking kids? It's hard.
Totally. I feel you. I feel you. I think it depends on the dynamic of your home, and it depends on your own capacity. And, capacity for parents, it waxes and wanes. There are some seasons that you're like, I could meet with, each one for listening prayer, during the week at some point. And there are some seasons when you're just like, I'm just making sure people eat. And all of that is wonderful and acceptable and good parenting. And there are ways, so noticing your own capacity is one thing. The second is, you can do it in a group. One of the things that I do at Haven House with groups of children when it's not COVID is we do some watercolor painting, and we do that through prayer. So, where have you met God today? Would you like to paint that? And what color was that experience to you? So, if they're struggling with some identification of words, they can associate it with feeling. So it could be something like that. It could be, in one group of children, we had a Lego competition. And that looked like building something that represented how you feel about God that day. And so the kids spent like 25 minutes building these intricate Lego whatever expressions. And then we just had a few moments where they could talk about what that meant to them. So see the recognition in the building, and then the response in the sharing. So it may be that. Maybe going through your recycling and allowing them to build something that reflects something really good that has happened to them in the last month. I was reading, any of you that are, I'm going to grab this little video. It's called Helping Children Grieve. You can get it from Paraclete Press. And in it, they talk about having a grief tree. And that might be a good thing to do in our families right now, to have a grief tree. And on the leaves, we write that thing, that those losses that are there. And then as spring starts to come, maybe we add flowers to our grief tree, naming the goods that we notice that are here with us. Because that's one of the things about grief, is we bring our sorrow, and we also bring God's presence, because grief doesn't take out God's goods that are with us. So there's so many creative ways that you can do that as a family. And please be gentle with yourself. Capacity matters.
Yeah, that's great. Kat, maybe you could just do it with groups of children the same age. Lacy, Kat has a set of triplets and a set of twins, right? And there must be all under 7, maybe? No.
No twins. They're a year apart, the older two, and then triplets. But
Okay.
they were all within 3 years. So it's like a little pack of boys.
Oh, please, friend, be gentle with yourself.
It's a mix, isn't it? Because yes, I do intentionally practice gentleness with myself. And yet I have these 5 little souls who I want to steward, and I want to teach them to hear from God. So I loved your book. It's just wrestling with, how do I incorporate this in a way that realistically I can? So I love your suggestions. Thank you.
Well, one of the things that that I think is so fun with young children, particularly, is reading them a little passage from Jesus's life, one that is appropriate for them, and then inviting them to role play it. And if you've got 5 little people, you should film it. You can make money off of that. I'm just kidding. Don't do that. But what a way to engage Scripture. Get their bodies in on it.
Yeah. Hey, here's what I want to say. We're a little past 8. I'm real comfortable with hanging around, and I am going to stick around. And Lacy, you're welcome to as well, but I know that it's not as early for you as it is for us here. But is there anyone else that hasn't asked a question yet? And then when we're kind of wrapped up, if there, we can have some open conversation. But any other questions that you have from the time that we've spent together? You can just go ahead. Elizabeth, you have a question?
Yeah, I do. You froze out, and I think you were addressing that a little bit, and you came back in and you were talking about the boundary. And I think my question is broader even than originally I was talking about disrespect, but I was even thinking of anger. How do you be present to anger in a child? And one of your slides was teaching them the appropriate ways to, without sending them away, which
Right.
conveys to them, you're alone with those emotions that I don't deem pleasing. Or how do we be present to a child's anger and yet boundaried with it? I wondered if you could speak to that.
Thank you so very much for that. I think of Mr. Rogers. He talked about strong emotions and pounding on the piano keys and letting sound represent those strong emotions. So that would be one way. If you don't have a piano, art is a great place to funnel strong emotions. Putting a crayon in the hand of a child who is angry and letting them put their energy into those scribbles is a very healthy place to funnel the force of anger. We have a we have a punching bag on the deck that has really helped. It has really helped because often our strongest emotions, it can help us to process them if we move our major muscle groups. And we've gone out and punched it together, because I think you make a wonderful and wise point, that we need to show acceptance of the person as they have those strong emotions, acceptance of the child. Having strong emotions doesn't mean that I reject you. And saying that you can't hurt, harm, is saying, I love you. And here's another way to funnel it. Thank you for that.
Okay, anyone else have a question or want to weigh into the conversation? Okay, I just want to ask one other question, Lacy. I don't know if it can be anyway, one other question. I'm wondering how important is story? How important is imagination? You have a story that you tell in the book about, I think, Jeremy, who talks about a dragon, or anyway, it's a really interesting story. How do you use, I mean, you've talked about letting kids build things or draw things. And so is that how you would bring imagination? And how important is imagination and story to this idea of listening well?
Well, I think it's everything, both the stories we tell. And in fact, I'm so glad you asked that, because I did have some books I wanted to recommend. So yeah. Can I offer some children's books?
Yeah.
I got a whole huge stack of them. I went through them. So here's a book on Lent. So tomorrow is the beginning of Lent, Ash Wednesday. And this book, I really like it. It's called Wild Hope. And it is stories for Lent from the Vanishing. So it is actually about endangered species. So if you have a little friend in your home who cares deeply about animals, this is just a wonderful time to be together. The stories are short, and it invites wonder. So inviting them to wonder. Another Lent book that I really like is called Make Room, A Child's Guide to Lent and Easter. And this just tells what they do and some practices. There are some very practical practices in them, in this book. And I really like that one. Okay. Two books around grief. One is called Sad Isn't Bad. And it's a Good-Grif Guidebook for kids dealing with loss. And yes. And this is called My Favorite Color is Blue Sometimes. And this is, again, another good book about grief. Just two more quick books. One is called Journey to the Heart. And this is a book about prayer for children. And the last book is, I love this book. I really do. It's called Psalms for Young Children. And it has wonderful prayers in it. In fact, if you were going to have the little 3x5 index card box on your table, or you just want to open these up, it has prayers like, here's Psalm 70. Help me, God, I am worried. Please hurry up. I know that you are strong. You are the only one who can help me. And they're all, and the pictures are wonderful. The illustrations are fantastic as well. And there's this, yeah. So you asked about story. I think children's books help bring our imagination to story. I think the narratives such as Narnia are wonderful places for children to invest their stories and let that shape their imagination. I could give you a book list a mile long, but
that's awesome. This has been great. Lacy, I'm so grateful for your time. I'm grateful for your friendship. I'm grateful to know your kids and your family, and just thanks for taking time. Let me just pray for us, and then if you want to stick around, welcome. If not, understand, and thanks for showing up. So, Lord, thank you for just a good reminder about listening. Help us to be attentive to the people around us. Help us to be thoughtful about learning to listen better. So, it's just good to be reminded of that. Thanks for Lacy. Thank you for the work she's done. Thank you for the time that she spent not only in preparing in life for the things that she's sharing with us tonight, but also for taking the time to be here tonight. We're grateful for all of that, and that you have shown us about relationship, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and you continue to teach us and draw us and pursue us. We're so grateful for that in Jesus. Amen.
I wonder, can I pray the blessing that's at the end of the book over everyone?
Absolutely.
Can I do that? May you experience children with a renewed heart. May you become increasingly aware of children and greet them in common places like the grocery store and the park, even if you're wearing a mask. May your deepening sensitivity to childhood experience change the way you think and live. May you encourage a child's life with God through listening to what is being spoken and also to what is being said. May your life become one of prayer for children as people who are on the margins of society. May you honor the God-given autonomy of children, taking special care not to manipulate or smother them. May you be granted the awe-inspiring opportunity to witness a child's life with God. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Lacy. Thank you, all of you, for being here, and thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Good night.
Good night, friends. Good night. Good night. Good to see you.